Good morning, good afternoon. All of you waiting at the door, feel free to come on in. We have a really exciting webinar planned today, and over 200 or so people signed up from all over the world. So I want to give folks a moment to come in. In the meantime, for those of you who've joined, if you want, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you are, what you do. If you would like to remain anonymous, remember you can always change your name by clicking next to your name on the three dots and renaming to anonymous. So do your risk evaluation and decide how you want to identify. But I'm coming to you all from Washington, D.C., and really happy to have this many people showing up today. So we'll give folks a second. If you can just pop in the chat if you can hear me okay and see my slides okay, that would be great. Nope, that is the wrong screen. Let's try that again. That should be right. Okay, let me know if you can see that and see it in full presentation mode. Yep. Okay, I'm gonna pop the chat open too. Great. Thanks, everyone. All right. Okay, let me get the slides back up to where we would start. And if you are just joining us, welcome. We're going to start about 2 minutes after the hour here. We have 200 plus people signed up, which is fantastic. So I want to give just one more moment for people to join us with the understanding that we have a hard stop at the top of the hour. If you feel like introducing yourself, please feel free to do so in the chat. It's nice to see where everyone's coming from and what their backgrounds are. But again, if you are not comfortable with sharing your identity in any way, remember you can always change your, rename yourself and make yourself anonymous. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation today around risk tolerance and how you show up in some of these settings. I know a number of us, I suspect many of us on this webinar have submitted comments on the OMB rule that closed for comment yesterday. So we are all wading into this work and it's becoming more acute every day. So the conversation around risk assessment is going to be fascinating. I'm really grateful to Stephen and to Vera for joining us today. So let me just see how many people we've got. We've got about 70 people. 70 is good. Let's start there. Greetings, wherever this message may find you. Morning, afternoon, evening. Welcome to our seventh Defend Research webinar this year, focusing on risks and realities around being a researcher in an authoritarian context. Some housekeeping. The webinar is going to be recorded and shared on YouTube. We will stop recording at the Q&A. If you're not comfortable being recorded, we'll turn that off. Remember, you can anonymize yourself in the Zoom if you want. And if you have any note takers that automatically pop up, we're going to ask you to turn those off, or we will just decline entrance if you have a note taker. So respectfully, if you can leave your machine friends at home for now, that would be great. Before we dive in, I'd like to briefly introduce Defend Research. Many of you have been on multiple webinars, but our work has been evolving. Originally, we really focused on the declaration to defend research from US government censorship, and all the screen what are those things called? QR codes. All the QR codes you see on every slide will link you directly to the declaration should you wish to sign. But really, our work has moved and evolved beyond that, thanks to the leadership of Lisa Schiff. We're just a group of volunteers who've come together to mobilize a scholarly communications community to resist government censorship. We all identify as volunteers. We have our org IDs, which you're welcome to. You can figure out who we are, where we work, but all of us, in the interest of reducing risk for our employers and ourselves, do not affiliate with our employers, and we're a group of volunteers representing different aspects of scholarly publishing. I really like this quote from Lisa and Alice, because it's important to think, well, why this? There's a ton of news coverage on attacks on science, on cuts to budgets. Obviously, this OMB rule that closed on Monday is getting a ton of attention. We really wanted to focus specifically on censorship and academic inquiry, because that can get lost in the overwhelm of everything this administration is doing, to squash science in the US. And everything that we'll be talking about, whether it's the OMB comment or other instances of this kind of repression, all of them include censorship in some context. But as scholarly communications professionals, we specifically wanted to drill down here. And so you're seeing this in a lot of cases. And if there are cases that we're missing here, please share them. Many of you are on the ground in very different contexts. There's actual lists of banned words that are getting updated all the time. There's data disappearance, taking down data, publications, findings, often done in stealth after people only realize it's happened days or weeks later. International publishing is now at risk with foreign collaboration. NSF just announced, I believe yesterday or today, that in to prep for compliance with the OMB rule, they will be restricting funding of collaborations with Chinese authors. And people are losing their jobs. So it's the whole gamut of consequences. And the question is, how can we engage in that context? So our site is really dedicated to working to amplify opportunities for resistance and the voices who are doing that to mobilize action. And so we're really lucky to have Vera and Stephen here today, because the kind of work they're doing is both very much grounded in actual things that we can do to resist this kind of work, as well as an important way to amplify the powerful work that they are doing as well. So I don't need to inundate you with terrible headlines. I think most of us have seen these, and this is, a month out of date now, but everything remains here. But the more important thing is our goal for the webinar is when you walk away today, you have a sense of things that you can do. Despair, inaction, thinking, throwing up your hands, none of those are options. As difficult as things are, we need to be making sure that we are strapping in for the next set of work that needs to be done. So our site will include these resources. The handbook Stephen and Vera have co-authored is publicly available, and we will include follow-up after the webinar with everyone who registered. And to those who are watching this on recording, you can always go to our website as well for those. So with that, really delighted to introduce our speakers as part of a two-part session. So today, Stephen will be leading us off by focusing on the Anti-Autocracy Handbook, and his co-author Vera is going to do some trailers for what's coming in August. So if you haven't signed up for the August webinar, please do. And with that, I'm going to let Stephen and Vera introduce themselves. The origin of this conversation for us was discovering the handbook and thinking, wow, we need to reach out to the authors to see if they'll share this with our communities. So with that, Stephen, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, let you introduce yourself. I will be monitoring the chat, and I hope folks will keep an active discussion in the chat, because I will use that to inform our Q&A discussion during the rest of the session. Take it away, Stephen.
Okay, thanks so much. I hope you can see my screen. Yeah, I'm Stephan Lewandowsky. I'm a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol. I've been studying misinformation, disinformation, democratic backsliding for, well, more than 20 years now. I started with the Iraqi non-existent weapons of mass destruction in 2003. That's what triggered my interest. Yeah, talking about history, I'm old enough to remember the end of history, which was announced in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, and all of a sudden there was democracy everywhere, and everybody believed in the liberal consensus. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. History is far from over, as far as I can tell. And quite on the contrary, we're now in a phase of democratic backsliding, some of it quite rapid and dramatic, as you can see here. The United States in the last 12 months has basically lost about 50 or 60 years worth of increasing democracy like that. And the EU and other countries like it are not quite as bad yet, but we also have problems of backsliding. One of us who was involved in the handbook is running this website that I highly recommend called the Trump Action Tracker, which is keeping track with amazing, painstaking detail of every single thing this administration has done that is attacking democracy. And the last I checked a couple of days ago, it was up to 3,500. And by now, of course, it is higher still. Very important resource. Go and have a look. And it's very meticulous about things that affect academics and others. So here we are. We have a problem. And now what? What are we going to do? Well, that's where our team comes in. And as Sarah already said, Vera is one of our team, but there's a whole bunch of us shown here. We produced this anti-autocracy handbook based on our own research, but also our own experiences, as you will learn later today. And again in August, Vera grew up before history ended, behind the Berlin Wall, and has firsthand experience with autocracy. So some of us have had personal experience. We all have professional and political experience. And yeah, it's now available in 4 languages other than English as well. So I can't go through the whole handbook. There's no point. I'll just summarize our core approach. The core approach is a risk-based take on the issue. By that, I mean, what is your risk as a person when you're trying to meet or confront autocratization, autocrats, and democratic backsliding? Well, there are 2 components. One, of course, is the absolute level of risk that emerges from the regime, depending on where you are. You know, maybe they shoot you on sight, maybe they torture you, or you're in a hybrid society where that isn't quite standard yet, where there is still some compliance with the law by the regime on occasion. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is personal factors. You know, it makes a huge difference whether you're a tenured senior white male like myself, who can take a lot more risks, or a visa student, female person of color from, let's say, Turkey, who is in the United States on a limited visa. So that is crucial to our approach, and there are detailed sort of steps in the handbook and elsewhere that tell you how to assess the risk. I don't want to dwell on that today. I want to focus instead on certain actions that everybody can take that transcend your personal risk. These are things that are actually mainly psychological. That's what I want to focus on, because those are things we can deal with on our own. Now, let me talk about a few of these obstacles, and then I'm going to talk about a few solutions and then open it up to discussion. Now, this is based on what we know about strongmen, autocrats, and assorted people of that sort. They try to project power and universal approval. They always do. You know, 24/7, that is their job, to pretend that they're all powerful. Now, they aren't, at least not initially. And the people opposing them are never alone. And one of the things that I found very striking after Trump took over last year was for how long it took for people in the United States seemingly to recognize that they're not alone. Now it is very clear that there is some resistance, in particular within certain domains that are under the most grotesque siege, namely the public health services. But that is true elsewhere. You're not alone. And that's important to realize. Now, the other thing that's important to realize, and this is based on Timothy Snyder's work on tyranny, avoid anticipatory obedience. Don't obey in advance, thinking, oh my God, if I do this already before I'm being asked, maybe he'll be nice to me. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. You may have to comply, but wait for the memo. and say, oh yeah, can you put that in writing, please? Whatever it is they asked you to do. Do not comply in advance. Any little grain of salt or sand you can throw into the machinery of a regime is slowing them down and makes it harder for them, and that is worthwhile doing. And if you do it right, then it's very hard for them to hold it against you as well, because you sound reasonable in all of this. Another thing to be aware of, and I'm using my own example here because I fell prey to this, is to avoid self-censorship, which is incredibly tempting and easy to slide into. This is a chapter I wrote in about, 2018, 2019, during Trump's first term about, is he a fascist? Yes or no? And it was relevant to the content of the chapter. And I kind of came down on the side of saying, well, no, he isn't really. Most people don't think he is. Well, that was rubbish. I didn't believe that at the time. I was convinced he was a fascist, but I also knew that I would be one of the few people saying that. So I kind of hedged. That's a real problem. I won't do that again, I promise. But the important thing is to recognize how this can happen to you and to then discuss it, have a conversation with trusted colleagues, just verifying whether you're still actually, am I still speaking the truth or am I bending over in order to avoid something here? Now, you may have to out of, for reasons of safety, but you got to know what you're doing and not slide into it. Here's another thing that strongmen and others thrive on. They accuse, especially academics, of being political. They're activists. They're all liberals. My God, these terrible enemies. J.D. Vance called academics enemies. Um, and, that is echoed within many academics. When I talk to them, they say, oh, I don't want to get into politics. Now, sometimes it's for very good reason. I mean, why should you do political, some science that is favoring explicitly one party over the other? I mean, it's dodgy sometimes. However, there's some data that, with rare exceptions, tell us that scientists who are advocates for positions do not lose trust in the public's eye, provided that their quote unquote activism or advocacy is within their area of expertise. So if medical doctors talk about lung cancer and smoking and are advocating tobacco control, that's okay in the public's eye. Ditto with climate scientists and climate mitigation and so on. So if you stay within your domain, you don't have to be fearful that somebody is going to lose trust just because you express a position on a policy issue. Now, the final point, and that's really most important from my point of view, is that there are situations when being political, not being political, rather, is itself a political act. And I think we live in those times right now. If somebody says, I don't want to get into politics, they are deeply in politics because they are supporting what is happening now in terms of democratic backsliding, whether you like it or not. Sorry, there's no way out. You're in this one way or the other. And by pretending not to be political, you can't escape the reality that is unfortunately unfolding. Now, those were the four things I wanted to mention briefly. There's several others, lots of them. This can go on for a long time, but I want to emphasize two things. Number one, these all arise from psychological or cognitive barriers within our own minds, which means that we can overcome them. But that requires tools. And now let me turn to the tools for another few minutes to give you some concrete sort of hints as to how one can navigate this very difficult space. Now, the first thing I think we need to be aware of is what we need is precision in language. This is a Nazi salute, okay? Now, I'm prepared to say that out loud in public, repeat it, It is. I know what a Nazi salute looks like. I don't have to be hedging. I don't have to send a tweet that says, oh my God, he made an awkward gesture in a moment of enthusiasm. Well, no, come on. Stay home. Spare me that. That's not what happened. And I think it's extremely important that we don't fall prey to, being reasonable. Well, if you have a choice between being accurate and reasonable, I would prefer accuracy. But okay, maybe other people feel differently. Similarly, you have to identify doublespeak. And this is, I find this fascinating from a research perspective as well as a cognitive scientist. Um, they are so good at doublespeak. Here is one example, restoring gold standard science from last year. The order seeks to ensure that federally funded research is transparent, rigorous, best, credible, reliable, impartial scientific evidence. Yeah, it sounds fantastic. Who could object? Well, I did. I objected strenuously. I wrote a piece in Science um, calling it a Trojan horse that is trying to undermine science. Why? Well, because effectively it makes science impossible because political appointees have the final word in what gets published, what is accepted as scientific misconduct or real science, and they can penalize the researchers involved. These are all federal researchers. And there's no possibility of appeal. Well, that's not gold standard science. That's what was known as having commissars in the Soviet Union, party operatives who enforced the party's view on science. And Vera, I'm sure, has a lot to say about that later or in August. Now, this permeates everything they do, doublespeak. And whatever they say, it's always the opposite that's actually true. And the trick is to find, to actually find out, it's in paragraph 3 where they're inverting what they started out saying. Now, together with that comes something that, again, based on my research, is very dear to my heart, and that is that we have to have a commitment to the existence of facts. You don't necessarily have to agree in every instance on what exactly the evidence is. Of course not. I'm not saying that. But we got to at least have a commitment to the fact that certain things can be ascertained beyond reasonable doubt. For example, I don't think Belgium invaded Germany in 1914 to start World War I. No, it didn't happen. It was the other way around. Poland didn't invade Germany in 1939, although the Nazis tried to make the world believe that. No, that's not what happened. Likewise, Ukraine did not invade Russia 4 years ago or 5 years ago. Why is that important? Well, because here we have one dude who actually thinks, hey, Ukraine, you should have never started that war. Wait a minute. That's how can you say that? That didn't happen. Now, those are the cases where you really have to dig in and say, there is a fact here and you're turning it upside down. Which leads me on to, I think, almost my last point, cognitive traps. Again, this is something that this regime is brilliant at. I think they're really skilled in many ways, not in supporting democracy, but in lots of other ways. And laying cognitive traps is one of them. And this is how they reframe everything to be the complete opposite of what it actually is. For example, they now have recast misinformation research, my own included, as censorship. Well, no, it's not. Fact checking is counter speech. It's not censorship. It's just holding people accountable through speech. Um, and they're invoking free speech to escape accountability. And that's the exact opposite of what free speech is really about. Likewise, voter suppression. They call that election integrity. Yeah, right. It isn't. It has the distinct purpose for certain people not to be able to vote. Likewise, DEI is now recast as discrimination. Well, it isn't. Looking for capable females to be on a panel at a scientific conference is not discrimination. It just means that you're making sure that you have a diverse and balanced sample, and the list goes on. Um, these are very well designed. They infest public discourse. The mainstream media are very bad at detecting this. I mean, really bad. And what we have to do as academics to make sure we don't fall into the same traps and that we try, wherever possible, to reframe it. And the final thing I want to talk about, I have another 2 minutes or so, is the importance of self-care. Mental health
Even you're
will
good
be
on time, so don't feel like you need to rush.
okay, good. Yeah, I've only got two more slides. When you're feeling threatened, and I know this from personal experience, or your safety is compromised, then your cognition doesn't function on all cylinders. It is necessarily that way. Now, if that happens to you, remember that you're not alone. You're never alone. There's always somebody else who's had similar experiences. Reach out to them and talk it through. If you're in a position where you're not yourself threatened, but others are, and you want to help them, don't ask them to tell you what you can do to help. Oh, what can I do to help you? Don't do that because that puts a cognitive load on them to make a decision, which is the last thing they want. Tell them instead, I'm going to do this for you. And if you don't like it, tell me not to do it. That's much better, reduces their cognitive load. If you have a good idea, they'll say, yeah, great, do that. And you've saved them cognitive load. And from experience, I tell you, the last thing you want to do when you're in the middle of all this with attacks and freedom of information requests and all that, you don't want to have to make another decision, even if it is people who are trying to help you. All right, so that was my whirlwind so far, 18 and a half minute tour through the Anti-Autocracy Handbook and associated issues. I want to make one last important point, very important. I've been talking here about individuals and what you and I can do. That's for two reasons. Number one, it's what I study. I'm a cognitive scientist. Number two, it's also the only concrete advice I can give you now. But in no way should that detract from the need that if you really want to do something about this, you've got to organize and mobilize. Now, fortunately, there's good data to suggest that if an opposition movement recruits more than 3.5% of the population, they're nearly always successful. So that's your target. And the No Kings marches were pretty good, but they haven't hit 3.5% yet. But once they do, I think things are looking a lot better. This is an empirical result that is remarkably stable. And finally, two QR codes, one for the Anti-Autocracy Handbook and the other one for a report that is summarizing the entire issue of democracy in the internet for the European Commission, which I was a lead author on, that just came out a few months ago. And if you want to know anything about the internet and democracy and why they don't work together, that's your go-to place. And with that, 20 minutes, 7 seconds, I shall
I'm
stop
impressed.
and wait for your questions.
Right on point. Yeah, let's open it up to questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat or the question box right now. I think everybody's absorbing. I've also been live posting on Blue Sky as you've been talking. So, and these are questions for both of you. So I'll dive right in, keeping in mind that Vera is going to do a little teaser of the August 12 session as well. But the first question, so there were a couple things that came up that I wanted to dig into. So one of the comments, this statement that I don't want to be seen as political. I'm an academic. I study English literature. I study, viruses, right? Vaccines, whatever. We are in this really interesting moment where speaking from a place of expertise seems to also be considered suspicious.
Mm.
That and I hate to use the word, I'm a social scientist, so the idea of, objective knowledge always is a little bit problematic for me. But the idea that, Stephen works in this space, he is, deeply accredited, He understands the landscape. When he makes a recommendation or a call, is grounded in evidence. That itself is inherently for some communities that
Sure.
we engage with is suspicious, right? So how do you,
Sure.
would you amend that recommendation based on, the attacks that we've seen on many experts? Uh, I think Anthony Fauci is the most obvious one, but I think you know
Well,
what I'm
he
getting
is.
at here.
Well, he's. Yeah. No. I mean, not at all. I mean, on the contrary, I think you have to explain if you know what's going on, you have to explain why this is happening. Who in their right mind would say, let's not listen to doctors when it comes to medical issue. Let's listen to a guy on Twitter instead. What? I mean, it's kind of like, didn't you go to school? It really is. We have to realize how insane the situation is. Okay. What? You don't want to listen to climate scientists who've been doing this for 60 years and who for 120 years have known that there'll be climate change if we keep on burning coal. We really have to kind of turn it around and saying, what's wrong here? Because there is lots wrong. And of course, what is wrong is that this is a concerted assault on science and not just science, but the whole idea of evidence. It's an assault on the justice system. It's an assault on democracy. This is not a coincidental sort of, oh, gee, shucks, somebody's making a mistake. No, it's a programmatic insurrection against democracy and 120 years of progress. And I think we have to say that. Otherwise, people keep pretending that, oh, yeah, the midterms. Well, no, the midterms will possibly put a
Will
dent.
not solve this for us. It's true. The thing that you're making me think of here is, and you said it yourself, I've been talking about the gold standard science. You labeled it a Trojan horse, and some of the speaking I've been doing for Defend Research, I've illustrated it as sort of the horseshoe theory, right, where we're weaponizing open science as a
Of
mechanism, or
course.
gold standard as a mechanism to forward a political agenda.
Yes.
And I think one of the ironies of openness, which is something that many people who are attending this webinar value as a sort of normative priority, is that you get the RFK Juniors of the world finding the
Of
one
course.
paper, right, that backs up their point. So great, you want to talk about science? Let me show you some science. And you're looking at that science and you're going, that was retracted, the data's been problem like this
Sure.
this landscape we live in does not lend itself to any kind of nuance, right? And so as academics and people in our field who nuance first, right? That's how we approach problems. What are your recommendations to people who are feeling that, that's not working for them?
Well, I think first of all, the whole thing about openness is you're absolutely right. Openness, opens you up to attacks as well as to replication. Undoubtedly, it's a tool for bad faith actors. But if there were no openness, then what they would do instead is to accuse you of secrecy. And they would
That's a
say,
great
where are
point.
the data? Why aren't you releasing the data? Where are the data? I mean, that's exactly what happened with climate science. And they did that for a very long time, even after the data were available, because it was very effective. I mean, it hints at this conspiracy. If you say they're hiding something, the
Yeah.
earth is actually flat, but they're hiding the data. That's very successful in a certain milieu
Well,
of,
I like the framing you're there because you're the what you just suggested, which I think is a very useful tactic rhetorically when we're talking to people. And there's a couple questions that speak to this in the Q&A, so I'll pull them up. Is you're rejecting the premise, right? When someone goes, but look, I have science that backs up my view. You just sort of reject the premise and say, look, that science. This is how science works. It's about iterative understanding over time. It's a process, right? It's not this was right and this was wrong. So I think in our efforts to be uh, good faith actors, we
sure.
accept the premise too much. And I think what you're recommending here is powerful. Is don't buy into the rhetorical device they're using, which is a bad faith one.
Yeah, exactly. I think yes, as a scientist, the most natural thing is to say, "Oh gosh, really? and to enter in a good faith debate with
Right,
somebody who has zero interest in a good faith
right,
debate, but whose only interest is to undermine your credibility. And
right.
that's a losing proposition. You can't do that. So
Yeah,
what you have to do is you have to talk about them, basically. Why are
and,
there people who are saying this? You know, when I look at what climate skeptics, so-called, what they say, I've done a blind test of what they say, and my sample of experts all said, well, that's dishonest. Why are
yeah.
they lying? You know,
Well,
so
so this is
you have to put the
fascinating.
attention where it belongs, which is their conduct and not yours.
And I think many of us who identify as, in the left are always frustrated are at the left's inability to do this kind of ruthless rhetoric,
Mm.
right? Like we always want to engage in good faith and be open
Yeah,
and inclusive, and fundamentally
yeah,
sometimes there needs to be a ruthless rejection of that and get to the heart of why the tactics are being used. And I think we struggle with that
yeah.
in some ways
Yeah,
as
I
a group.
know. I know it's
So it's
very
something we need
tempting
to
to say,
remember.
oh no, here's a paper by Smith, 1987 that proves the opposite or whatever, but
Yeah.
that's not what it's about.
Yeah,
It's
that's
it's
right.
it's about them attacking science. So you have to flip it around
Yeah.
and get them, and that's difficult. It is not easy to do that, but you can certainly do it in writing if you have the opportunity for op-eds or something, or on social media, and even in person if you're giving a talk and some guy shows up, just ask him.
Yeah.
So, why do you think it is that 15,000 climate scientists around the world all come to the same conclusion after looking at the evidence? Why do you think that is? And then
Yeah.
they have to say, oh, it's a conspiracy. And the moment they
Right.
do that, you can say,
Right.
yeah, well, that's one option. But the other option is that they actually know what they're doing and they did the research and came up with that result.
Yeah, I like that frame. I mean, it's a useful framing for folks to walk away with this idea, but that's not what this is about, right? When someone is sort of coming with that rhetorical approach, just calling it
Mhm.
out and saying that's not actually what this is about, and moving the argument into territory that points to the bad faith
Yeah.
engagement, I think
Yeah,
is
exactly. Ask them why Exxon's. I mean, I'm using climate change because I'm totally familiar with it and I worked in that
yeah,
arena many years. But, somebody says, there's a scientist here who says climate change is a hoax. Then ask them, well, why do you think all the Exxon scientists came up with the same climate models
right.
as everybody else? And why is Exxon drilling for oil using the forecast of the IPCC to accommodate sea level rise? Why do you think they would do that?
Yeah,
Are they in
yeah,
on this conspiracy?
yeah.
Which is actually true. I mean, this is the thing. Exxon knows about climate change, and their scientists are very good, actually. Their models are terrific. It's just
Yeah,
that they're working for a company that happens to
to
lie.
want certain outcomes. That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
There's
They
there's some
lie
really
for
good.
their profits.
That's right. There's some really good questions in the chat here that I would love to flag, and thanks to folks. Keep them coming. I can't quite get to everything in the chat, so if you can put them in the questions box, that would be great. And Vera, please jump in as well. I know you've got much to say on these topics as well. This question of pretending not to be political, and again, or not pretending, genuinely saying that, I'm a political scientist by training. To me, everything is inherently political because everything is about power, right? The ability to do science unobstructed in the ways that we have sort of taken for granted in this country is very much a function of the fact that the people who have the guns have allowed it, right? So I reject the notion that anything is could ever walk away from being political. But the question the attendee has that I think is a great one is, how does one speak with colleagues who tell you, I just want to teach students and do my research? They're not currently in a group in the crosshairs, and they believe that they're in a blue state, so it'll be fine. What should be the response to someone, I suppose, besides berating them? What's a productive?
Yeah, well, berating is tempting,
It is tempting, but not
just
productive.
as arguing with a climate denier is tempting, but it's not, no, you can't, shouldn't do that. I mean, maybe you can, and it's tempting, but no. Well, I would ask, so what are you afraid of? And maybe they'll tell you. And whatever they're afraid of, I would then ask them, well, why aren't you afraid of being snatched off the street by masked thugs that work for the federal government? And if they then say, oh, I'm white, I don't have anything to worry about, well, then at least you know. And also you can then tell them, yeah, but have you thought of other people who are not white and male and old and senior and all that? So, I think that's how I would approach it. I would first ask them what's keeping them, what they're afraid of. But maybe Vera has some other, I mean, she's lived through this a lot more than any of us, I think.
Well, a lot more is maybe an overstatement. But yes, I am of that age that I remember how things worked back in the Soviet Union and back in the GDR, the two countries that I grew up in. Um, and what I would say is from my personal experience,
Vera, do you
most
mind sharing a
people,
little bit of your background before you dive into your recommendation here, just so people um br brief
sure,
introduction of how you're coming at this?
do you want me to bring up my
Yeah, that would be
see
great.
the
That's a good
slides,
time. I
or
think now's a good
but
time. Yeah,
I want to get to the okay.
we'll
Let
definitely
me.
get to the answer.
Um, can you see the slides? Hang
Not
on.
yet.
Nah,
Ah,
nope.
yes.
There we go. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But let me. But they're not advancing. Hang on.
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
there
they
we
just
There
are.
we go.
came
So
up.
There we go. Title
okay,
slide.
so sorry about that. Yeah, so that's me, and you may have seen earlier it said professor of psychology of language learning. So what I'm talking about in this context has actually very little to do with my normal day-to-day academic research, because what drew me into this sort of work was an intense sense of déjà vu of like I've seen this before. We've been
Mm.
there before, and I have sort of a personal sense of what it feels like, but a sense of somebody who was not like we are now, sort of having the feeling of sliding into an autocracy, remembering what it's like to live in a democratic political system, but of someone who was actually born into that system and had no idea that things can actually be done some other way. So to just give you a little bit of the my background, so I was born in the Soviet Union. I grew up in the GDR, in what some call East Germany. I then went back to the Soviet Union. I did my undergraduate and master's studies there, then returned to the GDR, started working there as an academic, did my PhD, and then the Berlin Wall came down. So I was adult enough to have a recollection of what things were like. And I'm just going to jump through my slides because there was a point I was going to make to that question that just was posed. So in the Anti-Autocracy Handbook, we tried to come up with a chart of what kind of behavioral affordances or types of behaviors actually do exist for people in or for scholars in these situations. And the one that I've circled here is the one that is going to be the most frequent one. And when I say the most frequent one, this is, of course, based on recollection, on um, anecdotal evidence, because it is very, very difficult. And I tried to look in the literature. It's very, very difficult to come up with quantitative, hard research from within an autocracy. But I would venture to claim that keeping your head down and following without much questioning is probably the modal strategy in such situations, which may sound disheartening, but I think it is important to have an awareness. And when you, as the questioner just asked, when you are faced with someone who says, I just want to do my teaching and I'm in a blue state and things will work out fine, I think the least we can do is give them an awareness of where they actually stand and what they're actually doing. At the very least, to have sort of an awareness of your behavioral stance in that situation. but I don't want to sound all gloomy in saying that
Actually,
most
Vera, can I
people.
jump in there though? Can I jump in there and just ask you to elaborate a little further? So when I look at this chart, and I think this chart is a really powerful chart, I hope you'll spend more time on it in the context of your presentation on the 12th of August. Um, you know, to the questioner, I have an instinct like if you were to put this in front of someone who is in the circle, right? When you, Vera, say, show them kind of what the consequence of this position is, how would you explain that in light of this chart?
That is a good question. I think where I'm trying to get to, and what works, and what I've witnessed myself, are sort of creative ways of subversion that um, preserve people's safety, that address the risk assessment, while at the same time trying to find ways of dissenting almost in a Schweikian way. If someone has read the Brave Soldier Schweik kind of story, uh, trying to subvert the existing system where it's possible. Direct comparisons between the autocracies of the 20th century and what we're observing now, of course, are always fraught with kind of difficulties. And I would say the risk back then was extremely high. And that's what I base my sort of recollection and experience on. So dissenting and openly disagreeing was not really an option in those systems.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. What I'm reading here is to intentionally choose this. It's one thing to intentionally choose this, understanding what you are committing to in I'm going to put my head down, which, as I read it on this chart, you are sort of potentially putting yourself, you are presenting sort of complicity or acceptance and potentially even support, depending on how this manifests. So in my head, if I'm going to choose, it's one thing to choose this position, it's another thing to accidentally fall into it, which is something, Stephen, you brought up before. And I think um, my question to a researcher who's taking that view would be, well, are you taking this intentionally or are you just sliding into it? Because, you can wake up one day and end up in a place that's very different. It's better to sort of choose that, right? And the example, what this is making me think of is, and unfortunately, we've had another bout of US, not US citizens, but folks living and working in the US who are now being killed by essentially secret police. And the number of people who don't know about it is shocking. But when they do know about it, I think what's more worrying than actively supporting it is indifference, right? Because it doesn't actually affect them. They're okay for now. And to Stephen's point, well, it doesn't until it does. So it's one thing to choose that intentionally, and it's another thing to slide into it. So I really appreciate the work that you
good,
guys did on this.
very
And
good question. So let me just clarify. This chart includes behavioral strategies of people who are sort of observing the slide into autocratization, but it also encompasses the behavior of people who are born into these systems. They don't
that,
choose this.
right. And that's
And
different.
that's why this was the modal strategy. This was me back then, being born into that system, not knowing anything else and not knowing any better, and only realizing years later, after the wall had come down, what it actually was. So,
Yeah, and
in a
that's the
sense,
distinction I'm trying to tease out there. Yeah, that's really
what
helpful.
that chart is missing is the third dimension, the time dimension, right? And I'm talking about, and this is my concern, and also if I sort of keep with the teaser, what I want to talk about a little bit in August, my big concern is the next generation, the people who are now, what we call Gen Alpha, our students, who are being socialized into that new system if that process is not halted. And what, if anything, we can do about that? And how can we sort of preemptively think about that? So you're absolutely right. But this strategy that I circled here, that is the modal strategy mainly of people who are born into that system.
And that is such a critical distinction. We did a webinar, I think our last webinar, I've lost track of time, of an early career researcher talking about exactly that. He's going through his first round of funding with NIH and watching all of this happen in real time and trying to figure out how does he navigate this, because it's not the paradigm his professors told him about, right? His expectations were different, but he's now experiencing it really differently. So amazing preview for August 12. If you haven't registered, please do. I want to make sure we capture a couple of other questions before we lead to some closing exhortations, hopefully from both of you. The first question about is something in the past we see in the 20th century where science and research are funding was attacked. I actually often start this webinar with a editorial from Nature in 1933 that is specifically calling out what Germany is doing to the research endeavor as something that is inimical to what science stands for, to what collaboration stands for. So this absolutely is not new. The efforts in the Soviet Union are maybe some of the most extreme, if anyone's looked at the history there. But we're in a very privileged position, I think, in the US to feel like this could never happen here. Meanwhile, our colleagues all over the world who are born into that, who've seen it time and time again, are sitting there scratching their heads going, read a history book. So we have the benefit of knowing that it's happened before, allows us to think about, can we do it differently this time? So a strong yes to that question. And
Yeah,
next
can I
question.
can I just
Yeah, please, Stephen.
add something to that? I've been thinking about this, looking at the question. I mean, first of all, yes, the pattern is repeating itself, and again, I think it's important to understand why. And the answer is that science and the justice system are the two arenas in a society that are driven by evidence, at least ideally and in theory, yes. And we don't always live up to that, but it's certainly what everybody in science is trying to do, irrespective of political pressure, and the justice system even more so. And that's why those two institutions are always in the crosshairs of autocrats from day one. It's no coincidence that J.D. Vance thinks professors are the enemy. Yes, we are the enemy because we're not driven by fantasies and ideology. We're trying to be evidence-based. We accept climate change and want to do something about it. And the same in the justice system. So I think, and just understanding that, I think is already giving you an opening into, what's the countermeasure here? And I think the countermeasure is to reveal what is going on, who they are, what they are doing, why they're doing it, and that you're no matter what you do, you will be targeted if you're a scientist, unless you do something that they're not interested in. But you know what? There's hardly anything that they wouldn't be interested in sooner or later if it just happens to interfere with something they
Yeah.
want.
And if you want
Yeah.
an example of this, reading up on the impact of Soviet policy on research in Russia is a really, really good example
Genetics,
of
yeah, which you would
genetics, right?
think is
There's
pretty, yeah,
the yeah, there was nothing that was off the table in terms of wading into. So
exactly.
this idea that, I studied fairy tales in, Greek literature, like that's not going to be enough at some point. So there's one more concrete question here I want to grab. Could you please suggest actions that academics and staff at research universities um, could take who work within the limits and systemic risk of an at-will workplace and don't have union or tenure? What are things that we can do to protect ourselves? And I'm really grateful for this question because I've had a lot of friends and colleagues overseas, ask, why aren't Americans in the street every single day of the week? Like, why are you allowing, And I have to explain, most Americans are one health incident away from bankruptcy, right? Most
Yeah,
people are 2 or 3 paychecks away from being homeless. There's no net that protects any of
yeah,
us from catastrophe that can stop us from feeding our kids. And so I appreciate the realism in this question and turn it to both of you. Perhaps it could be a way that we can close out today's session and prep for August 12th.
Do you want to go ahead there, or do you want me to
Uh,
go?
yeah, so maybe if I jump in there again with my very last slide here, um, because that sort of closes it nicely. If I just uh, so I mentioned this concept earlier of sort of creative subversion. So there may come a time where all of this will not be possible, where open dissent will not be possible, where it will be too dangerous, where demonstrating on the street, or and this is very much or shares many similarities with how things were in the Soviet Union in the 30s up until the 50s, I would say. And yet, and yet there were very small, very much at the margins, were attempts of subverting that. There and this is just a table with some of these what I call creative strategies, where I then also will try to see whether we can find some similarly creatively subversive strategies, contemporary subversive strategies. So just to flag just one example, because we spoke about genetics as being the most egregious example of Lysenkoism. Um, so there is this interesting experiment looking at genetic transmission of tameness in Siberian silver foxes that ran for many, many years by Belayev and his colleagues. And that started still under Stalin, or very sure, I forgot which year exactly. It started in the 50s. The way they sold it to the authorities is that it's done in the name of increase of fur production. And it is these almost silly sounding subversive examples of which I have to say our day-to-day life was full, that maybe can provide uh, some way of maintaining and safeguarding our scholarship. And that's what I want to, the reasons for that, that's what I want to, why I think this is important to think as it were out of the box. Right now, people very often think in writing to your representative, engaging in activism. What other methods are there when that is no longer possible or no longer a viable strategy?
That's fantastic, Vera. And you're already teeing up quite a bit of excitement in the chat for your August 12th. And Stephen, I know you have a hard stop, so I want to give you the last word here. And if you have to jump off, we'll do the wrap up without you if we hit time.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to go in a minute or so. There's not much else to say. I think this is a very difficult situation. The enormity of what's going on shouldn't be underestimated. It is really a rupture, not some evolution. Anything can happen. Really bad stuff can happen, but also good stuff potentially if people mobilize and organize, and if we're lucky and determined and all that. And yeah, I think it's up to all of us to try and make that happen, and in lots of different ways. There's no silver bullet, there's no magic solution. We all have to find our own path through this, and the more we talk to each other and have conversations such as this one today, the more likely we are to kind of maybe develop something that's helpful.
Yeah, I really want to I'm just going to jump to the end of the deck here. Actually, no, wrong direction. As folks are thinking about what they can do in their context. So I think Vera is going to speak to this really powerfully as well. And Stephen, this book, the fact that it's open and shareable, I think it makes it an even more valuable resource. What I'd like to leave folks with, and please visit our site for resources and tools, is to not disavow or disregard or disdain small acts of resistance, right? I've definitely heard individuals, I'm so disappointed in X organization or Y organization because they haven't spoken out publicly. But we don't know what they're doing behind the scenes to ensure that the work keeps getting done, that it stays, truly scientifically robust with, integrity. So it's tempting to, I think, view sort of loud, overt action as like preferred. But I what I like about the strategies, Vera, that you suggested there, as well as some of the work around slowing the machine, are that small things also make a difference over time, and many people doing small things can be quite powerful. So don't reject those things, and given the risk profiles that we all have that are different, that's an important thing to value. So with that, I really want to thank Vera and Stephen for joining us today. I want to thank all of you who took time out of your day. Please share the recordings and the resources that we have here. I've also live tweeted it, posted, shall I say, on Blue Sky. Feel free to repost any of that. We will be back August 12th with Vera. And with that, have a safe summer. Make sure you're staying cool, and we'll speak in a month. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Vera.